Thousands of lives are endangered. Declare martial law now or shoot down 1,000 church members with machine guns. The mayor of Jonesboro, Arkansas, telegraphed this urgent message to Governor Harvey Parnell on a September morning in 1931. The mayor's day had not started out very well. The evening before, police officers broke up a fistfight between two warring factions at First Baptist Church and arrested 3 men. For weeks, hundreds of Jonesboro Baptists had taken part in an increasingly heated dispute between traveling evangelist Joe Jeffers and the minister at First Baptist, which is one of the largest churches in the Delta. The police hoped that the arrests would prevent further violence by making an example of the fighters. Instead, Jeffers and his supporters gathered in protest on the courthouse steps in the morning, singing hymns. Jeffers demanded that the mayor permit him to hold a church service where they stood. The mayor declined, but he allowed Jeffers a moment of prayer. When Jeffers' moment turned into several minutes, the mayor interrupted. And Jeffers promptly fell to his knees on the courthouse lawn and asked God to, quote, strike the mayor dead with a bolt of lightning, unquote. The mayor interrupted again, and a member of Jeffers' faction punched him in the jaw and knocked him to the ground. Two more men attacked the chief of police, who stood by the mayor's side and tried to rescue him. A third officer rescued the first two, and city officials then telegrammed Little Rock for help immediately. They also asked the governor to declare martial law, but he refused. Governor Parnell did activate several dozen National Guardsmen from surrounding counties. For 4 days, troops armed with machine guns patrolled the streets of Jonesboro and stood inside the tent that Jeffers had erected for his services. All of this to take care of some unruly church members. Jeffers continued to hold daily revival meetings. Men and women continued to pour into Jonesboro from nearby communities and even across the state line from Missouri to hear him. Jeffers' sermons blended explications of his fundamentalist theology with denunciations of local leaders. He posted handbills around town that read, "How many children in Jonesboro call Mayor Bosler Daddy?" He also had a more urgent message. Jeffers preached most frequently and enthusiastically about the imminent return of Christ. He even dared set a date. Most millennialists knew better at this point, but Jeffers set a date. Jesus would be back in less than a year, in May of 1932. Jeffers' Into the World preaching tour had taken him from right here in Washington, D.C., where he jumped out of an airplane, to Miami, to Los Angeles, but nowhere did his message resonate as deeply as in the Arkansas Delta, perhaps because nowhere did it feel quite so much like the end of the world had already begun. During the early 1930s, black and white farmers in the region staged food riots and attended socialist rallies. Economic and environmental disaster in the Delta regions of Arkansas and Mississippi became one of the earliest and most powerful symbols of the Great Depression. Even before the economic crisis that engulfed the Delta and the nation had a name, religious leaders defined it as, at bottom, a spiritual crisis. Joe Jeffers joined a growing contingent of men and women who understood the Depression in apocalyptic terms. An equally radical group of religious leaders on the left predicted that the Depression would spark a religious uprising against capitalism to be led by farmers, miners, and factory workers. But most religious leaders anticipated no revolution, whether divine or human in origin. Clergy in the largest Protestant denominations in the Delta joined their counterparts nationwide in describing the Great Depression as the prerequisite for a great revival. As one Mississippi Methodist put it, in the midst of good times, many people usually forget God, but they now see the folly of it all and are ready to hear what God has to say about things. These three competing visions for the nation's future, established in the early 1930s, defined the way that churches and people of faith responded in the coming years as the Depression became the Great Depression. And as they reimagined the future of the nation in those years, the churches also reshaped their own futures. The Delta churches had a head start in facing crisis. Dominated by vast cotton plantations on rich riverside soil, the Delta's fortunes tumbled along with the nation's cotton prices after World War I. An agricultural depression kicked off the 1920s in the region, and soon many small farmers went bankrupt. Pushed off their own land, they became sharecroppers on someone else's or on the vast plantations increasingly held by distant corporations. About the only thing boring in the Delta in the 1920s was the Mississippi River. In 1927, the river burst through the levees built to contain it and washed away entire towns. Together, the agricultural depression and the flood left a majority of Delta farmers without land. By 1930, 63% of Arkansas farmers and 72% of Mississippi farmers could not claim a square inch of their own soil. Those numbers rose as high as 95% in some Delta counties. Their resources exhausted, Delta residents and Delta churches alike could only hope that the new decade would bring the prosperity that had eluded them in the 1920s. And we know it didn't. In 1927, it had seemed as though it would never stop raining in the region. In 1930 and 1931, farmers wondered if it would ever rain again. The worst drought in the region's recorded history combined with record high temperatures to scorch the tender cotton stalks as soon as they pushed through the parched ground. The region's few food crops didn't survive either, and poor farmers could not prepare for the winter. Those who had savings lost them in the bank failures that swept the nation. In January of 1931, black and white farmers outside England, Arkansas, made national headlines when they marched into town together demanding food. When Joe Jeffers arrived in Jonesboro 8 months later, local farmers had endured a second dry, scorching summer, and they dreaded the cold, hungry winter months that they knew lay ahead. Many residents of the Delta had long subscribed to some form of premillennialism, the belief that Christ would soon return to do battle with an antichrist before establishing his kingdom on earth. Jeffers' message was not new to them, but his prediction that the apocalypse was only months away gave meaning to the suffering that had come to define their lives. Furthermore, Jeffers' willingness to denounce local preachers and community leaders echoed poor farmers' frustration with a religious and political system that had proven unresponsive to their needs. Jeffers' revivals in the Delta were part of a larger national trend toward a premillennial understanding of world events. During World War I, premillennialism reached a high tide as the rise of European dictators and the argument of the League of Nations seemed to bear out scriptural predictions about the last days. Prophecy belief declined in visibility, at least during the 1920s, but by the early 30s, new prophecy journals appeared nationwide, including Philadelphia Presbyterian Donald Gray Barnhouse's Revelation in 1931 and John R. Rice's Sword of the Lord in 1934.